start our conversation with Douglas Holtz-Eakin, President, the American Action Forum, of course, economist, former OMB director, or CBO director. Douglas, forgive me. It's great to have you back with us here on Bloomberg TV and radio.
Thanks, Joe.
This has been an interesting conversation about tariffs and taxes. And we'll start on the Donald Trump side here. Are you getting religion as a Republican on tariffs, Douglas?
I've had religion for a long time about tariffs, thank you. But I don't think it's the same religion that Donald Trump is practicing.
Okay.
There are really two strong beliefs that he continues to display that have been really fully repudiated by the research literature. The first is that, tariffs are a tax. They are a tax on purchases from foreign sellers, and there's always a question in taxes as to who bears the economic burden of the tax. Is there a way to shift it back to the seller and not bear the incidence in the United States? The answer from the literature is no. Consumers will bear these taxes, and as a result, will be made worse off, other things being the same, by the tariff policy. And his tariff policies are big. A $3 trillion proposal for a 10% across-the-board tariff. So that's sort of the first thing he clings to. And the second is, what is being accomplished by the tariff? And his assertion would be, we're going to stop trading for particular goods, especially manufactured goods, and make them in the United States instead, and we will be better as a result. But that goes against the vast amount of evidence that there are gains from international trade, and there are gains from trade in general, and tariffs are undoing those gains from trade. So they're not going to make average Americans better off in two ways. They'll bear the burden of the tariff, and they will also have more expensive products from which to choose.
Well, okay, Donald Trump definitely pushed back against that idea in this conversation yesterday, as we've seen him do repeatedly when confronted with that kind of reasoning from economists. He contended, to your point about it being more about making stuff in the U.S., that the whole idea with his tariffs is you make, and I'm quoting directly here, them so high, so horrible, so obnoxious that they'll come right away. They, meaning companies that currently are making goods in the U.S., will come to the U.S. Even if that is how that would actually translate, how long would that take for the reordering of supply chains and the building of manufacturing facilities realistically?
That's a decades-long process, to say the least. And remember, locations are not driven just by taxes, tariffs. Locations are driven by access to markets. And a lot of facilities are not in the United States because there are greater markets outside and greater opportunities for U.S. companies to provide profits back to the United States and a standard of living in the United States by selling abroad. So to focus narrowly on that, I think, misses the point. The second thing that gets missed by that is, you're diminishing the pressure on domestic producers. If you got a big tariff wall, they don't have to keep their prices low to sell things. They can raise their prices to just under the tariff wall. And, if you ask anyone, are you going to do that? They'll say, oh, no, we would never do that. But if you look at what happens in response to tariffs, prices rise for the protected products. That's not good for any of us.
Well, it makes you wonder what life is going to be like at the CBO. I know he doesn't necessarily need Congress for tariffs, but President Trump would need Congress to pass the tax proposals that he's put forth, making permanent the 2017 tax cuts. And he's added a raft of them since. You know this, Douglas, whether you're talking about deductions for auto loan payments, tips, overtime, some of the other stuff. Also the SALT
Social
cap.
Security. Yeah.
CBO ought to start working on this with the green visors now.
Yes, these are proposals that don't fit any coherent philosophy. So one of the things that I just noticed that there isn't in this race a candidate who has a consistent pro-growth philosophy that relies on the private sector and believes a small contained government should get out of its way to the extent possible. That's missing. Instead, we have statist candidates who believe that they run the economy and they're going to provide the goodies to whoever they favor. So that's what you're getting. And sort of handouts at campaign stops is not new in presidential politics. But what's really, I think, most important about the Trump proposals is they're often quite large. These aren't small rifle shots. And something has to happen next year. Unlike the usual campaign thing, which is, oh, well, we just couldn't get it done. We didn't get support on Capitol Hill. A tax bill has to happen next year. And people who have been promised something on the campaign, no tax on tips, overtime, whatever it might be, are going to be asking the White House, why isn't it happening? And it's going to make the process of getting to yes in 2025 harder even than it needed to be. And it's hard to begin with.
Well, and then there's the other side of that equation, which is spending. Donald Trump is talking about supplementing the lost revenue with the income from tariffs, of growing our way partially out of the tax cuts. But spending cuts are going to have to come somewhere, right? Even if there was a red sweep in the balance of Congress in this election, along with the Donald Trump presidency, is it going to be that easy to get only lower taxes and no spending cuts through a House of Representatives, where we have seen a spending battle time and time again be very difficult to keep the Republican conference in line?
Yeah. I mean, let's put the politics aside for just 1 second. I know that's what the show's about, but let's just do the arithmetic.
We do policy here too, sir.
Social Security and Medicare, $36 trillion over the next 10 years, more than half of all non-interest spending. Those two programs are going to be growing at average rates of 5.5% for Social Security, 7% for Medicare. If the economy is growing at 2% real, 2% inflation, that's 4% nominal, that's how fast revenue will grow. It'll grow at 4%. So it's not going to be able to catch up with the spending. The only way to get the deficit under control is to actually get spending to come down to the pace of growth of the nominal economy. And I will just stipulate, they can have great growth policies. They're not going to move 4 to 7. That's not going to happen. So you got to get serious about spending. And what are the two programs the president said he won't touch? Social Security and Medicare. Vice President Harris is not going to touch those. Candidate Trump's not going to touch those. All of Washington is putting its head in the sand and ignoring the real problem. That's the real problem that needs to be dealt with.
I want to turn to the Fed here, Douglas. Donald Trump was asked about Fed independence yesterday. It's one of our favorite topics around here, and I don't know how you see this. Scott Bessent joined us the other day. He said it's no different than Elizabeth Warren shouting into the wind here when it comes to the Fed. Donald Trump can say whatever he wants. We're still going to have a Fed chair, although they are talking about an alternate Fed chair of some sort here. He was asked about this in the interview on Bloomberg. Here's how he characterized the job, Douglas.
I think it's the greatest job in government. You show up to the office once a month and you say, let's see, flip a coin. And everybody talks about you like you're a god. Oh, what will he do? I think that if you're a very good president with good sense, you should be able to at least talk to him. I don't say make the decision at all.
What do you think about this, Douglas? Are we making too big a deal of the idea of the president talking to the Fed chair, and is it the best job in government?
Well, I'll pass on whether it's the best job in government. I thought I had the best job in government at the CBO, so you can ask Jerome Powell what he thinks. Look, the president has enormous influence at the Fed. The president appoints all the governors, or they get Senate confirmation, chooses the chair. So it's not like the president has no say in Fed policy. He has an enormous say. There's nothing that stops the chairman of the Federal Reserve from having lunch with the Secretary of Treasury. That's gone on for decades and decades. And the Secretary explaining the administration's position to the Fed chair. And a good Fed chair will listen and then go back and do their job. So I don't think there's anything special about Trump elevating that to a public discussion about, I'd like this in it. The only question is whether you make structural changes that allow the President of the United States to put their thumb on the scale and change decisions of the FOMC. And I think that would be a mistake. All of the research evidence suggests that the independence of the Fed and monetary authorities in general produces better monetary policy. I think we should stick to that.
Well, as we consider the Fed's monetary policy, we have now entered a world in which policy is easing rather than tightening. We saw that first 50 basis point Fed cut. We could see 1 or 2 more this year, Douglas. My question is, what happens in 2025 when we have a new president? What is your expectation around what the fiscal policy pursued by that president and whatever Congress we get could mean ultimately for the path the Fed is likely to go down? Are they going to have to start hiking again in short order?
Well, I mean, I think we know maybe this isn't the best job in government because when asked that question, Chairman Powell had to dodge and weave like mad. So that's a hard job. Look, here's a scenario that is not crazy. We just talked about it, and it's very hard for the Fed. President Trump gets elected. He institutes across-the-board 10% tariff using executive authorities that he believes he has. What does the Fed do? Do they allow that to pass through and get a 10% increase in the price level, perhaps undermining their credibility in their fight against inflation? Or do they do a U-turn, lean against that by raising rates, and run the risk of a sharper downturn? this is a dilemma for the Fed. I know they don't want to talk about it in public, but in private, they have to be wargaming different scenarios to think about how they'll respond to any sort of administrative actions that could happen quickly and legislative actions that they'd be tracking during the course of 2025.
New York Times reporting Michelle Bowman could be on track to be a Fed chair in a Trump 2.0. Douglas, does that ring true?
I have no idea. I'm not privy to the personnel decisions of the Trump campaign. We'll stay tuned and watch what happens.
Let me ask you this about the narrative in Washington right now that Donald Trump, and a lot of this is based on the number crunching from the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget, that Donald Trump would be more of a threat to the nation's debt and deficit than Kamala Harris. In a big picture scenario, is that true?
I think in the big picture, neither is a particularly attractive candidate. Neither is dedicated to dealing with the trajectory of ever-rising debt and the unsustainable nature of the federal budget. Neither has sensible economic policies that will generate more rapid trend growth. And neither has a track record of follow-through. So these proposals on the campaign, his add up to a bigger number. But I'm interested in the track record of the individual in at key moments being willing to make tough decisions in favor of the future and having the ability to control the spending. Neither has any evidence on that front.
In our final minute here, Douglas, the Trump campaign and others we have spoken with have suggested things would be so different if COVID hadn't interrupted what was happening in the economy during his administration. When we reference back to the idea we didn't grow our way out of the 2017 tax cuts, to what extent is that true?
Well, I think that they should get a lot of credit for the initial jump start to the economy. I think what's been reported on too little is the regulatory controls. The regulatory controls in the Trump administration were extraordinary. We went from adding $100 billion a year in regulatory costs to essentially nothing. And it helped small businesses. It was a big part of the jump start. The tax bill was an enormously big step forward. There was a big spending push as well. And the economy was growing like mad. But then they picked a trade war with China, and we saw it slow right down. So if we hadn't seen COVID, it's an open question whether we would have kept slowing down or not.
All right, Douglas Holtz-Eakin, always great to have you here on Balance of Power. He is president at the American Action Forum. We appreciate your